Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third instalment of our Returning to Ireland webinar series. And this is going to be the last episode for this session. And tonight we're looking at access to services. My name is Una, and I'm from the Irish Support Agency. And before we get started, I would just like to acknowledge that I am hosting this webinar from the lands of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation. I also acknowledge the lands in which you are watching this webinar from, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So again, tonight we are delighted to be joined by Sarah Owen and Niall Foster from Crosscare Migrant Project, and they'll explain all about who they are. Just so you know that this webinar is being recorded. So if you have any personal questions that you would like to maybe put to the team, there will be contact information that provided at the end. Throughout the webinar, you can pop any questions into the chat box and we'll try and incorporate them into the conversation. Alternatively, there will be ample opportunity at the end to ask your own questions. And I really encourage you to use that time to ask Sarah and Niall your questions. It's a great opportunity. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah Owen. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Una, for that introduction. Una, if you're okay to move on to the next slide, that would be great. So just to give you a little overview of what we're going to be talking about this evening, obviously we'll touch on who we are and what we do, talk to you a little bit about trends in Irish migration, particularly return migration in the last few years, and then move on to the subject at hand, which is access to services. You can move on, Una. I like the cat in the background. So, as I said, I work for an organisation based in Dublin and we're called Crosscare Migrant Project. My colleague Niall Foster is here as well. We're funded by the Irish government's Emigrant support programme, which funds over 500 organisations around the world to provide support to Ireland's diaspora. And we were established in 1987 as Emigrant Advice. We've been working in the area of Irish migration since then, so we have some experience in this area. And we're also a project of Crosscare, which if you're from Dublin, you'll know is a large social services provider in the Dublin region. So how we do our work is we provide information, advocacy and referral supports to Irish people both leaving the country and people returning home from abroad. What we try and do is not promote emigration or promote return or dissuade either one. What we try and do is to help people make informed decisions about their migration and to support them if they are finding difficulties with accessing services, both abroad and at home. We link them in with groups like the Irish Support Agency abroad, and at home we often provide advocacy support to people who in some cases have been refused state services, things like social welfare payments, medical cards and so on, and we'll get into that into more detail. As well as that, we conduct research into Irish migration, and we're actually running a study at the moment that's looking at the experiences of Irish people of minority ethnic origin who have moved abroad. So that survey link is on our website if that's of interest to anyone. We also collaborate with Irish groups around the world. You can move on there, Una, thank you. Just to give you a little bit of a flavour of return migration, in recent years, there have been more Irish people returning home to Ireland than leaving. And that is partly as a result of the pandemic, but also there's push and pull factors. So we know that there are employment opportunities increasing in various sectors in Ireland, and that is obviously attracting people home. And then obviously the fact that people have been away for so long, distance has been amplified by the pandemic. And that's another really big reason for people making the move back, particularly from places like Australia and the US. So a few things to consider if you are thinking of returning home to Ireland. The first of which is obviously to plan and do your research. Try not to have a knee-jerk reaction and move home because something has happened in Australia. If you can avoid it, to try and plan and make that move in a sort of planned way over a few months, thinking really about whether this is the right decision for you. Do what you can beforehand. So there's plenty of things you can only do once you arrive in the country, but there's also lots of things you can get started when you're abroad. That includes social welfare applications. You can start looking at the forms and collecting the documentation you'll need to put in applications. The same thing with if you're going to be applying for any sort of health-related supports here in Ireland, you can start that process before you return, and that will really help you to get up and running, if you like, once you're back here as soon as possible. Having savings and budgeting is, of course, one of the very important things, but there are supports available to you that you can apply for if you're going to need a little bit of help on that front. Just one thing to say is really do what's right for you and try and have realistic expectations. Whether you left the country a year ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, there are things that are going to have to that are going to have changed, whether that's yourself or the country, or indeed your circumstances before or on your move back. So a lot of people might have emigrated as single people coming back with families. It's a very different dynamic that you're coming back into. So just keep that in mind and give yourself time to adjust. I like this quote here that's from a returnee from Australia that's talk to others who've done it, as in done the move, but take your time with the decision and think about why you were doing it. I think I'll leave you with those words on that front, and we'll move straight into access to services. So there's lots of myths surrounding social welfare services and access. You may have heard some of these. So things like, well, you can only apply once you've been back for 2 years. You may have heard tell of the habitual residence condition, which I'll go into in more detail. But what I'd like to do is address some of those things today and just give you some practical information about this process. So first off to say, you can apply for a social welfare payment on your return. You can do that immediately on your return, in fact. That doesn't guarantee that you're going to be granted the payment. So that's what we'll be talking about here. How can you demonstrate that you've returned to Ireland for good and that you are eligible for whatever payment you're applying for? There's criteria you have to satisfy. A lot of the times you will have to show your means. You will also have to show, as I say, that you've come home for good. You'll also need things like PPS numbers. So your PPS number is a unique public services number that you would have had living in Ireland before. If you can't remember what that is, you'll find it on any sort of official document that you have that's from Ireland, or indeed you can call Client Identity Services or email them, and the details are on these slides, which will be circulated later. And they'll retrieve the number for you and send it back to you. It's like a tax file number in Australia, just to help with the comparison if it's been some time since you've had one of those. So there's two different types of payments broadly in Ireland: social insurance and social assistance payment. So if you've worked and paid social insurance in Ireland and you've been gone for a shorter period of time, you might be able to access a social insurance payment. So something like a contributory Irish pension, job seekers benefit, carers benefit, etc. Now, if you've been gone for 2, 3, 4 years, it's unlikely you're going to be accessing one of these, unless, of course, you're of pension age. So the likelihood is you'll be applying for a social assistance payment, which is a payment that is means tested. So things like the non-contributory pension, the job seekers allowance, disability allowance, and you will have to show that you have a certain level of income and that you are habitually resident in Ireland. I can move on now, Una. So what is the habitual residence condition? I mentioned it already about 10 times in the last 5 minutes. It's something you have to satisfy to qualify for a social assistance payment and for most means tested payments in Ireland. So as an Irish person who has lived in Ireland and has gone abroad, you can satisfy this condition, but you will need to show that you've either maintained your residence in Ireland or that you are resuming your residence in Ireland. So what that looks like is, for instance, you went to Australia 3 years ago on a working holiday, you ended up standing for a year, and now you're looking at coming back. You kept all your bank accounts open at home, your family are all still here. You can show that you've maintained your residence here in that way by proving that all those things have happened, okay? So providing details of the bank accounts that you've kept open in Ireland, providing details of the fact that you're on a short-term visa permission for Australia. If, however, you've been gone for 5, 10, 15, even 20 years, you might be looking at showing that you're resuming your residence. So demonstrating the residence period you had in Ireland prior to departure. So the fact that you've lived here, you went to school here, all your family are here. And the fact that on your return, you are doing things that someone who is settling in a country would be doing. So you're registering with a doctor, you're taking out a tenancy or looking at purchasing a home, you're opening bank accounts, and that you're closing off your life in Australia. So some of the things that a social welfare officer will look at is these 5 factors. So where your main centre of interest is. So where is your home? Where is your main residence, if you like? Where are your close family members? Are they living in Ireland? What sort of ties do you have here that would indicate that you are settled or settling in Ireland? They look at the length and continuity of your residence in Ireland and other countries, so obviously Australia, purpose of any absence from Ireland, so why you went abroad in the first place, nature and pattern of your employment, and your intentions to live in Ireland for the foreseeable future. Now, they won't make a decision on just one of these things and that's it, you're not habitually resident. They have to look at all of them together and to place equal weight on them. But it does mean that the onus is on you as the applicant to help the deciding officer understand your situation. And that's what we'll talk about now on the next slide. So as I said, this is what the habitual residence means for Irish citizens returning. These are the Department of Social Protection operational guidelines, and they state that a returning Irish migrant or those resuming habitual residence can be regarded as habitually resident immediately on their return to state. So as you'll see, there's no mention there of how long you have to be returning in Ireland. The emphasis is really on your residence and your return. The guidelines also state that if you've been returning home for regular intervals to visit family, or you've maintained a home here, it's possible that your centre of interest has never ceased to be Ireland. So this is what I was saying about the resuming versus maintaining your centre of interest in Ireland. So a few things that you can do to help the deciding officer with this are on the next slide. So you're going to need to fill in an HRC1 form. That text is hyperlinked. So when you do get the slides, just click on it and have a look at the form. The form is quite long, it's extensive, and it looks for a lot of information, and it can feel a little bit overwhelming, which is another reason to take a look at this before you come home rather than having to deal with it immediately on your return. So other than the form and all the information you'll need to provide in that, it's very, very, very important for you to provide as much documentary evidence as possible to show that your main centre of interest in Ireland. So this can be a variety of things. This is just a list of examples. If you don't have one of these things, it's not the end of the world. It's just to give you some ideas of the thoughts of things you can put in with your application. So proof of ending your tenancy abroad, ending your job abroad, if that's applicable, transferring any residence-based payments. That doesn't apply so much to Australia, but it's good to just mention that. Travel documents, so things like your one-way ticket back from Australia or transferring your belongings back to Ireland if you've got a shipping receipt or even excess baggage. An expired visa for the country you're returning from. This isn't the end of the world if, for instance, you're a dual Irish and Australian citizen. There's lots of other things you can do to show that you've returned for good. So closing your bank accounts or opening bank accounts in Ireland, and then providing details of family members in Ireland. We'd go as far as to say, you know, even if you can get a couple of letters of support from your family going, look, you know, we know that they're coming home for good. They've missed us terribly. They want to be back here. And if, say, you're living with family members, in the interim on your return, get the family member that you're staying with to put a letter in with a bill in their name and saying that they confirm that you're residing with them and will be until such time as you find appropriate accommodation. Including a cover letter is also something worth thinking about. And again, this might sound like a lot to do, but we can guide you through this process if you do need some help. So just feel free to get in touch. We'll have our contact details at the end of this presentation. But detailing essentially what your circumstances are, including the information of why you left Ireland and your life here before you went abroad, and then your reasons for return. It's also important to describe the ties that you're cutting with Australia. So obviously things like giving up a job and really helping the deciding officer understand that you are back for good. This can all help with your application, and putting this information up front at the beginning when you start the application is more likely that the decision will be successful in your favor, rather than putting in just the form and then they ask you for more information, and then this is extending the time, and you might find that something that might have taken a few months to decide is now suddenly 6 months in, you still don't have a decision. So we'd always say put in as much information up front as you can, and as I said, we can help you with this if you need assistance. Next slide, please. So as I said, the habitual residence condition applies to means tested payments in most cases. So you'll find information on this link here to do with the means assessment. Now, it's specific and varies from payment to payment. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I just wanted to put this slide in so that you're aware where to find more information on the means test for different payments. Citizensinformation.ie have the best overview of this. You can also look at gov.ie. Can move on there, Una. So just to give you an idea of some of the really common social welfare payments that the habitual residence condition would apply to. So job seekers allowance is probably the most important one to be aware of if you're coming home and you're going to be looking for work. So you're able to apply for this and provide information on the habitual residence condition, resuming a residence, and also information on your means. You'll also need to show that you are looking for employment in Ireland. The personal payment rate is €208 a week, but it can be higher than that, say, if you have an adult or child dependents. So there's more information in that link there, and indeed the green text on how to apply for this payment. But again, if you need assistance with it, get in touch with us and we can signpost you in the right direction. Disability allowance is another payment that, say, if you're returning and you have a disability, you're unable to work, it might be worth considering applying for this instead of just job seekers allowance. And again, the weekly rate of payment is the same. If, however, you're coming home and you're going to be caring for someone, that's providing full-time care to someone who lives with you, it's worth thinking about applying for carers allowance. Now, carers allowance can sometimes be tricky for people returning from abroad, just because of the fact that if you're going to be caring for someone who, say, for instance, they have an illness that is ultimately going to result in their passing, it can be sometimes hard to prove that you're back for good because you're back for a finite period of time. So if you are applying for carers allowance, do get in touch with us and we can absolutely help you to put in the strongest application possible. One parent family payment then is a payment for people who are parenting their children without the support of a partner. And again, there's more information in the link there. And if you are coming back with children, we did a webinar last week on returning with children that I would highly encourage you to watch. It's on the Irish Support Agency website and on migrantproject.ie as well. But if you're coming back with children, just to say, you can apply for something called child benefit. It's a universal payment, so everyone gets it. You don't actually have to satisfy a means test for it, but you do again have to show that you're back in Ireland for good. You're going to need PPS numbers for yourself and for your children to apply for this. And the rate of payment, if successful, and normally this is a relatively easy process, is €140 per month per child. So that can be really helpful if you're back and you're going to need to, say, buy lots of clothing for different seasons. Obviously, you're enjoying different seasons to what we are. I hear it's torrential rain in Sydney at the moment if you're there. But this is just worth noting that it's something that exists and it can help you on your return. With all these payments, it can take time for a decision to be made. So while you're waiting for that, if you do need some financial support, you can apply for something called Basic Supplementary Welfare Allowance. Now, habitual residence applies to this payment as well. And sometimes what we can find is it can take as long for a decision to be made on basic supplementary welfare allowance as it can for job seekers allowance, which is another reason we would say, if you are going to be applying for this in the interim, make sure you provide as much documentary proof to show that you've come home for good to help the deciding officer make a quick decision. And once again, if you need help with this, just get in touch with us. So you can apply for most social welfare payments online at services.mywelfare.ie, but in order to do that, you're going to need a public services card. So it's possible that on your return, you'll actually need to apply using a paper application form. You can get these at your local social welfare office or contacting the department that pays a particular payment, and they'll send you out a paper form. If you do set up your online My Welfare account, you're going to need a mygov.ie account. It's a relatively simple process, but again, the public services card is what can sometimes hold up the process. So if you think you're going to want to apply for things online, it's probably a good idea to get an appointment to get a public services card sooner rather than later on your return. You can actually book this while you're still abroad. There's no reason why that can't be done once you'll obviously be in the country when the appointment date is. Citizens information centres all around the country are a really helpful source of information as well. And if you're struggling with an application form and you need some help with filling that in, they can assist you in person to do that form. And there's a list of centres at centres.citizensinformation.ie. There's also more information on their website about lots of different social welfare payments. I only really touched on a few essential ones here, but there's a really, really wide range of them. So do have a look on their website. It's very, very clearly written, and it'll give you the full details of what you need to know. Now, if you are refused a payment, there are things that you can do. You have 21 days from the date of refusal to put in an appeal with the Social Welfare Appeals Office in Dublin. That is an independent appeals office. And in the letter that you're sending to them, you need to explain why you think the decision is wrong and why you think you should be getting this payment. If you have been told that you've been refused on the basis of habitual residence and that the deciding officer doesn't think you're habitually resident in Ireland, we would strongly suggest that you get in touch with us. You can drop us an email or give us a call at the number below, and we will go through both your application and your appeal with you and see if there's things that we can do to help with your appeal. Now, just to say, the appeals at the moment are taking a few months to process. So this isn't a quick process, okay? One of the reasons I say this is to reiterate the point of, if you're going to be applying for something on your return and the habitual residence condition applies to it, make sure you put as much information in with your application upfront to avoid having to wait longer if it's refused and then going through the appeals process. Okay, that's just really an important point to make. Next slide, please, Una. So when we talk about access to services, we're not just talking about social welfare and financial supports. We're also talking about things like public health services. And sometimes there can be some confusion from people who've lived abroad as to what they're entitled to when they come back. So just to say, once you are living here or you plan to live here for a period of 12 months or more, you are considered ordinarily resident in Ireland, and that means you can access public healthcare services here in the same way that any other resident in Ireland does, okay? So the fact you've lived abroad doesn't preclude you from accessing services immediately on your return. And just to say, if you are looking to get access to certain treatments or medical procedures, there are waiting lists. Those apply to everyone. They're not applying to you per se because you're just back from Australia, but it's just something to keep in mind, particularly if you're putting off treatment in Australia before you come back. It might be worth looking at what your options are in Australia as well, and weighing up, the pros and cons for yourself. If your income is below a certain level, or if, for instance, you're granted a social welfare payment, you can apply for a medical card. Now, what a medical card is, it's something that the HSE issues that allows you to access certain health services free of charge. That includes things like GP visits. You get prescription medications for a really, really reduced rate. And there's certainly inpatient and outpatient services as well that are covered by the medical card. So worth looking at. And again, the text is hyperlinked there, so do click that and have a read in more detail. GP visit cards are something else that you may be eligible for. So if for whatever reason you don't qualify for a medical card, you could still get a GP visit card because the income thresholds are higher. Now, something to say about the GP visit cards is they're now available for all children in Ireland under the age of 6 and all people in Ireland over the age of 70. You do still have to apply. It doesn't automatically get issued to you or to your children if they fall in the qualifying category, but the application process is really, really simple. And you do need to be registered with a doctor here to avail of this. So again, have a look at the text there and the hyperlink for GP visit card, and you'll see how to put in for the free GP visit card, which if you have children can really save you a fortune, given that GP visits are in the region of 50 to 80 euro, depending on where you're living in the country, for a consultation, that is. You can find a GP at this link here, hsc.ie, and it's important just to say that in a lot of places around the country, there are a shortage of GP places for people. So you might need to ring around. If you are eligible for a medical card and you get refused by 3 GPs in your local area who say they've got too many people on their books and they can't take you on, the HSC can actually allocate you with a GP in your area. So that's just something to note if you are on a medical card. If you're coming home and you're expecting a baby, once you're ordinarily a resident here, you'll be entitled to the maternity and infant care scheme, which means you'll get all your antenatal appointments with a public hospital here in Ireland. So that's just worth noting. The drugs payment scheme is something that I like to mention here because a lot of people don't know about this, but it means that if you are getting medications for yourself or your family members, and they're amounting to over 80 euro a month, if you apply for this and you're approved, then you can cap the amount that you're having to pay every month. So this could be really useful. Now, if, for instance, you or someone in your family has a long-term illness, things like diabetes or epilepsy, you could also get your medication free of charge. And to do that, you'd need to apply to the long-term illness scheme. So just 2 things there that can help with the cost of medications in particular. Something that's really important and sounds obvious, but a lot of people forget to do this, is before you come home to Ireland, ask your doctor in Australia for copies of your medical record. It can be so much easier to do this once you're actually in Australia than if you have to do it after the fact, okay? Now, if your doctor in Australia or your hospital that you're dealing with say they can only release these details to a doctor or medical professional, you might have to wait until you're back in Ireland to get details of a doctor that you're registered with for these medical records to be sent over. But it's still worth having a chat with your doctor in Australia before you come back, because as I said, between time zones and signing documentation and so on, it's so much easier to do in person than doing it remotely. So you can start this process before you come home. Now, I've been talking about public healthcare services, but if you're interested in private health insurance, there's a variety of private health insurance in Ireland. And the best place to look and compare plans is the HIA website. You can put in your age, exactly what you're looking for in a health insurance. And what it'll do is it'll pop up with a few different options and you can compare the best one for you. Now, just to say, with private health insurance, there are sometimes like you might have to wait to access certain levels of your health insurance or certain treatments and things like that. So it's worth checking that with the insurance provider before you actually sign on with them. Some of the big ones are obviously VHI, you've got Leia Healthcare, and they all provide different levels of care, and you can tailor what you need. But do have a look at HIA.ie and you can compare plans there, which is really, really useful before you make your decision. Go ahead, Una. So having somewhere to stay on your return is a really, really crucial part of moving back and making a settled return. If you're going to be staying with family, just think about the fact that in Ireland, renting at the moment can be quite hard. It can be hard to find somewhere in the local area. It can also be hard to find somewhere that's affordable. So if you're going to be staying with family, it's always worth having a chat with them about this and getting their ideas. They might know someone who's actually going to be renting a property out. They might have a network of connections locally that you can tap into. But also, more importantly, it sort of sets the expectation with them. The fact that you might not just be with them for a couple of weeks, it might be an extended stay, is worth having that conversation up front before you're staying with one another and getting annoyed about having, breadcrumbs on the counter and then having a big row about this. It's always worth having the conversation up front before you come home. And certainly they'll be more than happy in most cases, we find, to actually help you find somewhere if they have the networks that can support you with that. It's also worth having a look at daft.ie and myhome.ie at what is available in the area you want to come home to. Rents nationwide have gone up and they've gone up significantly in the last year. Average national rent is 1,500 roundabouts, but that varies wildly. Housing prices have also gone up, have shot up in recent times, and particularly in areas where housing prices would have stayed, I suppose, quite static. Things are going up now as people are looking more at quality of life and the ability to remote work. So in the west of Ireland, prices have actually shot up, I think the highest in the last quarter, as people look to move out of urban centres and over to the west. And so at the moment, Leitrim is the cheapest place that you can rent in. This is according to daft.ie's report, by the way. It's also the cheapest place to buy. And then, unsurprisingly, South County Dublin is the most expensive place to rent and the most expensive place to buy. There's lots in between, of course, but I'm just telling you this to give you an idea, particularly if you've been away for some time, you might not be aware of this. There are social housing supports available, and how that normally works is you'd apply to the local county council or city council in the area that you are residing in to be assessed for social housing. If then you're approved, you'd get put on a waiting list, and those waiting lists can be years long. So what the government have introduced in the last 4 or 5 years is something called the Housing Assistance Payment, which provides support with paying for rental accommodation. Now, what I will say is, whilst landlords are not allowed to refuse someone who is eligible for the housing assistance payment, sometimes they refuse and they don't actually tell you that's why they're doing it. So it's just something to keep in mind. Threshold, which I actually forgot to put a link in here for, but it's threshold.ie, the website. They are a national housing charity, and they do a lot of work on, say, discrimination around rentals, and they actually take cases as well sometimes against landlords. So they'll have full details of what your rights are when it comes to renting in Ireland. Definitely worth having a look at if it's something that you're thinking of doing. Now, our counterparts in an organisation called Safe Home Ireland do provide housing-related supports for older Irish immigrants. So if you're someone 50 plus and you're going to be returning home and you've been renting abroad, it's definitely worth getting in touch with Safe Home and looking at whether you're eligible for their housing support scheme. Ultimately, how it works is they would assist you to put in an application with the local authorities here whilst you're still living abroad. So you could go on the social housing waiting list for accommodation for older people whilst you're actually still living abroad. Then if you're approved, you'd move straight into that accommodation on return, which takes some of the hassle out of wondering where you're going to live in the meantime. Definitely worth looking at that support, and you'll find their website there at the bottom. It's safehomeireland.com, and it's /housing-assistance for details. Do have a look at that. And again, if you've forgotten all of this after we've done the presentation, just get in touch with Niall and I will happily chat through your options with you. Next slide, please, Una. Just a little note on other state services. So with driving, you can exchange your Australian driving license for an Irish one on your return. You do need to provide a letter of entitlement, and that's something you get from the Australian authorities. So again, get this before you come back. It's so much easier to get when you're in Australia than when you're in Ireland and then trying to get it sent out to you. It costs €55 to exchange a foreign driving license here in Ireland, and it's through the NDLS. So do have a look there at some of those links there if that's something you're going to be doing. If you're importing a vehicle, you might need to pay VRT, and you certainly will need to register your vehicle in Ireland on your return. Now, if you've owned that vehicle for at least 6 months before returning home, you might be able to get an exemption for VRT, but you still do need to register the vehicle, okay? That's just something to say. You might not have to pay it, but you still do need to register. If you're doing this, you're not going to be able to sell your vehicle for a period of time after returning if you're availing of that exemption. So that's something people aren't aware of all the time, worth noting. For shipping your belongings back to Ireland, you can get certain reliefs, certain tax reliefs on your personal property and household effects if you're going to be shipping those back. And if you are importing goods for commercial reasons, you might not be able to get a relief. So things like tools, for instance, if you have tools that are involved in a business or trade, you might not be able to get tax exemption on that. But it's always worth having a chat to revenue about this. They're actually really, really helpful. They have officers on the phones who answer really quickly. It's probably one of the easiest government departments to get in touch with. So do have a chat with them. They also have information on their website about tax residence and the implications of moving to Ireland. So have a look at revenue.ie for all of that. And then finally, if you're going to be bringing a pet back to Ireland, there's lots of different rules that apply depending on what sort of animal you're bringing home, and where you're coming back from, and whether they're going to be traveling with you or they're going to be traveling back separately. So rather than go into detail of all those variations, I'd suggest you have a look at pettravel.gov.ie, and then you can actually go through exactly what animal you're bringing back, which country you're coming back from. Obviously, in most cases, it'll be Australia for this call, but then whether they're going to be traveling back with you or not. They might be following you later, in which case they might have to go through a period of quarantine on arrival. So do take a look at pettravel.gov.ie for information on that. Go ahead, Una. There's some useful resources here. General government websites like gov.ie will give you details of everything and anything from all the various government departments. It's a really, really useful website. Can sometimes be a little bit hard to navigate, but there is a search function, so you can go in and have a look. Alternatively, you can get Google to do the searching for you, put gov.ie in, and then exactly what you're looking for, it'll take you straight to that page. HSE.ie is the website of the Health Service Executive, and that's where you'll find information on things like the medical card and the GP visit card, and also what sort of health services are available and provided in Ireland. There's also useful health information there, everything from common colds and flu to all the COVID related information. If you're applying for your public services card, you're going to be using this services.mywelfare.ie. You also then have our website and the website of the Irish Support Agency there. Citizens Information now have a really excellent section on their website that's all about returning to Ireland. Would encourage you to take a look there. Safe Home Ireland then is the other organisation I mentioned, and that's their website. If you're going to need to be renewing passports or applying for new passports, there's details there of the embassy and the consulate then in Sydney. And then you've got some really useful sort of social resources that can help. So one is Irish Expats Returning to Ireland Facebook group, and that's filled with people who are returning or have returned to Ireland from all over the world, giving each other advice and sharing information on services that they've used that they found really good. Now, one thing I will note about this group in particular is that everyone's experience is exactly that. It's their experience. So there are nuances depending on your own circumstances. And if someone's had a bad experience or a good experience, doesn't necessarily that'll be your experience, but it's always good to hear how others have found the move back. There's also an excellent Facebook group, which is Irish Women Abroad or Returning to Ireland. That's run by Sarah, who I believe is based in Sydney, who I think might be on this call this evening. But a really supportive group there, filled with women who are either living abroad or coming home, who are happy to share experiences. You then have Ireland Move Club Forum, which is written by a returnee from the States. So it is a little bit US centric, but there's lots of helpful tips, particularly around things like returning with pets. And that can be worth a read if you're doing that. And then there's the Irish Times Abroad, which obviously Irish Times being an Irish newspaper, but they have an abroad section that covers lots of information on returning to Ireland, but particularly first-person stories from people who have made the move back. People like James Parnell, who came back, I think now 6 years ago from Sydney and has really made a successful move back. He writes a lot for the Irish Times. Just worth having a read of some of those things because it might get you to think of things you hadn't thought about before. You can move on there. So in terms of contact details, this is how you can get in touch with us. I'd strongly suggest that you follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. We haven't quite made it to TikTok, but who knows, watch the space. I have to figure out all the dances first. But what we try and do on our social channels is share information for anyone thinking returning to Ireland, and also useful things about, say, groups abroad, the emotional impact of return, which we haven't had a chance to really go into this evening. We try and share a lot of information on that, sort of minding yourself if you're going abroad or you're coming home. And then obviously there's our website, migrantproject.ie, plenty of information on our website about the habitual residence condition in particular, but also information, say, if you're going to be returning with an Australian partner or spouse. There's information there on the immigration requirements. And in fact, we did a webinar on that there 2 weeks ago. That's on the Irish Support Agency website and on migrantproject.ie as well. So worth having a look at all of that. And then, of course, you can drop us an email. I would say give us a call, but given the time difference, it might actually be easier for you to email us. So when you do email us, just let us know a little bit about your circumstances, add in a few questions, and we'll come back to you probably with lots more questions. And if we don't know the answers to the things you're asking us, we'll signpost you out to places that can help. But we will always get back to you on that. So on that note, thank you very much, everyone. It's been a pleasure. I'm sure you're sick of listening to me now. So if you do have other questions, feel free to ask now, or alternatively, as I said, if there's things that you'd rather chat about in private, please just send us an email and either Niall or I will get on to you about that.
I actually have a question, Sarah. You no longer have an Irish bank account and you want to set up a new one. What are the documents that would be required for that?
That's a really good question, and actually it can sometimes be something that people find a little bit difficult on return. I know how easy it is to open a bank account in Australia, so there's a real contrast in Ireland, and that's partly to do, excuse me, that's partly to do with European regulations around money laundering and so on. So one of the main things you're going to need to be providing is proof of identity. They're really, really big on that. Proof of your identity, proof of your address in Ireland. And then they do ask for bank account statements, usually for the last 6 months previous, but depending on the type of account you're looking for, they're going to be looking for potentially longer statements. So I'd say before returning from Australia, get statements from any and all accounts you have, regardless of whether they're current or saving or whatever. Get all of that, have paper copies, have scanned copies, keep them on Google Drive, whatever you have to do, just have that stuff to hand, just in case they do ask for more detailed information. In terms of address, sometimes that can be something as well that can be a bit difficult for people, particularly if they're staying with family or friends on return. We always say, look, if you can get something official sent to the address that you're staying at, that can be helpful. So for instance, we were talking about the PPS number. If you can get something sent from Revenue that has your PPS number on it that goes to the address you're staying, and you can use that as proof of address, that can sometimes be stronger than, say, getting a letter from the friend or family member you're staying with. So address can sometimes be a bit of a difficult one at the beginning, but ultimately bearing in mind that there are lots of banks out there and they all have different requirements, it can be worth shopping around as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Welcome.
Does anyone else have any questions that they would like to ask the team? Feel free to pop it into the chat box, or you can switch your mic on.
I might actually pop something into the chat box for everyone.
Hi, sorry, I have a bit of a question, if that's okay.
Of course, Vidama.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm in the process of going to be retiring back to Ireland next year. So I'm trying to get as much information as I can. So I've spoken to Centrelink here in Australia, and they've told me you have to be 67 now to get the pension here, and I get the pension in Ireland when I turn 67. I've just turned 64, so I'm lost with where I go, what to do, anything like that. If I go to retire to Ireland next year, what my entitlement would be, because what I can guess what benefits I'd be entitled to then.
Yes, absolutely. I'll chat a little bit about that. And I'll say, if there's anything that you want to talk about in private, do feel free to get in touch as well that way. So ultimately, it sounds to me like on your return, you might be actually looking to apply for a job seekers payment for an initial period, just until you get to the age where you're at pension age. There is also a transition payment that you can apply for in between. And now with all of those, you will be looking at, particularly if you're applying for job seekers, you will be looking at the habitual residence condition, ensuring that you're resuming your residence back in Ireland. You'll also have to go through a means test. So it is a little bit of a detailed process, but it's not insurmountable. And we can chat you through all of that if you'd like some help with the process. That's no problem at all. I'd say just drop us an email, and then either myself or Niall can follow up with you. But there are options for you. It's just there's going to be a little bit of legwork on your side before you come back, and then once you're actually back here as well.
I'm actually going over there at the end of June for 3 weeks.
Oh, fantastic.
To see my my daughter, my granddaughter, and my sisters and that. But so it's just something I can do while I'm there.
So it would be great if you could, but unfortunately a lot of this is based on like where you're actually going to be residing. With the excuse me, with the contributory pension, you can get that whilst you're living abroad, but you're not of age. So unfortunately you can't start that yet, which is sort of unfortunate. What you can do though is things like your PPS number, retrieving that. You may already have that to hand, and if you do, that's great.
Yeah,
that's brilliant. You could also look at just finding out where like local services are that might be able to provide you with a little bit of hands-on assistance if you need it. So like citizens information, the local Intreo office, and then ourselves as well. You know, if you're back here, we can absolutely have a chat with you. You know, with the time difference, it's not a worry. We could even spend like an hour and go through your situation and look at what we think, you know, if there's other things you might be able to apply for and start the process on. We can guide you through that as well. So I'd say if you're going to be back in Ireland and you've got a little bit of time to spare within all the socializing and getting together with friends, like have a chat with us, you know. It'll help you ease your mind and get prepared for the move back.
So do you have an office that I could come into, or just on
we have an office in Dublin, but I'd say best bet is give us a call, because at the moment our office is actually being redeveloped. We're getting it all nice and shiny and spanking new. We've taken the opportunity with COVID to try and put in, you know, nice airy meeting rooms and so on. So just in case we're not up and running by the time you're back here, give us a call and we can either make an appointment to meet in person or we can go through things on the phone.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. So just one thing to add before we go, and obviously if there's other questions, happy to answer those, but I mentioned the emotional impact of returning home, and that's something that we didn't really have time to get into a great deal, but Fidelma, just as you've mentioned, coming home, it's worth thinking about this, you know. There is a period of adjustment. You're moving country, you're re-emigrating. I don't know when it was that you moved abroad, but there would have been things that you did and a period of time it took to adjust to your new life abroad. So it's worth thinking about that on your return. There are going to be things that you have to get used to, okay? On our website, so migrantproject.ie, we have a bunch of articles about, you know, how to mind yourself when you're making this move. And we also have lots of information on where to look for other people's experiences. So the Irish Times, I know I mentioned this a few times now, but I really, really would suggest having a look at their archive of returning to Ireland related articles. There's so much there about how people have found the move, and things like people saying, oh, well, I found I couldn't talk about my life in Australia when I got back. You know, people were sort of bored with it and having to deal with that and find out how they coped with it, you know, coped with their return. And then things like, you know, it was a great opportunity when I came back to Ireland. I got to travel around the country and really reconnect with Ireland and found that really useful. So obviously there's going to be things that work for some people and don't work for others, but definitely worth having a think about some of those things before moving back.
Yeah, it's been 32 years.
Okay, yeah, so absolutely. And look, there might be things that you come back and you just feel like this hasn't changed at all. It was like, you know, you left yesterday. And then there might be other things where you go, wow, okay, I actually hadn't really considered this before moving back. But it's great that you're doing a trip now for a good period to have a look around, see how you find it, all of that before moving back. Sometimes people don't necessarily have the ability to do that, and it can be a little bit harder for them. So yeah, make the most of your trip. Have a wonderful time.
And just to say also, speaking of the personal perspective on a return to Ireland, in 2 weeks' time on Monday, the 6th of June, we're going to be hosting a webinar with 3 people who have made the return to Ireland and what their experience has been like. Because often I think, you know, we're given the information, but it's really useful just to hear a personal story and a personal perspective on it. So that's in 2 weeks' time, and the details for joining that webinar will be on the ISA website. So unless there's any more questions, we'll close off for the evening. As Sarah mentioned, this reporting will be available on the ISA and Migrant Project website, as will the slides. But I just would like to thank Sarah and Niall for a tremendous input into these webinars, and such a useful resource that you guys have created. It's really wonderful, you know, the way that you've broken it down and made all of the information really digestible and easy to understand. So thank you so much. And thank you to those who have joined us this evening, and I hope you got the answers that you were looking for. And we'll say good night.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very
really
much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you all. Take care.
Okay. Bye.
Nice to meet you.
Bye.
Good evening.